Everyone, this is part 2 of our population lecture video. If you missed what I've been talking about up to this point, you probably want to stop here and go back and watch part 1 of the population lecture, which will be right above this in Canvas. So we finished last video talking about fertility rates. Mortality rates is the next term that I want to talk about, and this is what we call, of course, death. And there are two important terms here. One is infant mortality rate, and infant mortality rate are deaths before the age of 1 per 1,000 live births. And then life expectancy, which we talked about earlier in part 1 video. Infant mortality rate is a really important topic to talk about, especially here in the United States. We are a developed nation, and we have one of the highest infant mortality rates for developed countries. And there's a couple reasons why. In the United States, lack of access to health care leads a lot of pregnant people to wait or to avoid prenatal care. And with that is the fact that a lot of times children are born with complications and they die before the age of 1. We also had a huge SIDS issue for a lot of years. We still have SIDS around, and it is definitely something that the United States needs to keep an eye on and continue to research and fund research in that, or what we call sudden infant death syndrome. But as far as developed countries, the United States is significantly higher than every other developed nation, and that is due to lack of access to healthcare. It also has to do, of course, with individuals who work jobs that are paid per hour, and that leads to individuals not being able to take off from work because you lose pay for that day, and that can be very problematic for individuals who are being paid per hour. So lacks of access to healthcare of all sorts, whether you don't have insurance, whether they have shut a clinic near your house where you go for appointments, or you work a job that does not have leave. That becomes a big issue, especially for a developed country. We're really far behind. Population density is another topic that I want to talk about, and this is where people are populated together. And I kind of showed you that mapper earlier in part 1, which is this shows you population density, right? So it's where individuals live in a small area. Okay, so in the Northeast, we have a pretty dense population. So I know this map is kind of small, but if you can see here, there are pockets of high density, of course, in the Northeast corridor, but you can see out here, the population density is pretty low, which means that there's a large land area and not as many people who live there. I don't know if a lot of you have ever lived in a town where maybe the population is 500 people. That's really low, right? We're so used to living in city areas where there's tons of people. So we have a high population density compared to some other places. I'm going to head down here. Okay, so important terms. Arithmetic density, which is the measure of the number of people per area of land, per square mile or per square kilometer. It's not the best way to measure because, you know, it's an average. It's per land area. There's physiological density, which is the number of people per area of land, and this is the best way to measure in terms of, you know, it gives you kind of an idea of the physiological, the way the area is set up so that we know why people are living in those specific areas. Agricultural density is the number of farmers per area of arable land. So that's farmable land. Okay. And the textbook goes into a couple other reasons why there's a difference there. Another person that we need to talk about in terms of population is Thomas Malthus, and he wrote an essay on the principles of population in 1798, and it's really important for us to talk about that. He explicitly talked about something called the J curve, which is exponential growth. So it is population that grew in a short period of time, and you'll actually see almost a J-like figure, which I'll show you right here. Like this is a J curve. Okay, and do you see how it almost looks like a J in size? So it means that in the 1800s, the population was, you know, about 1 billion, right? And then it stayed pretty steady until the 1900s. So for 100 years, it stayed relatively the same. And then all of a sudden, it has exploded. So every 50 years, you can see that it exponentially increases. And that's what we call the J curve. So Thomas Malthus wrote this essay, and I think it's kind of, it's really interesting because he wrote this in the 1700s. And he talked about how population grows geometrically while food supply grows arithmetically, okay? And this is a big issue, meaning that he said there wasn't going to be enough food for people and people were going to die of famine. And that it was going to be really bad if we didn't figure out how to control the world's population. He did not, of course, foresee the kind of agricultural practices that we have now, right? So he didn't know about the Green Revolution, which is being able to grow food like, we used wheat and we crossbred wheat, and we were able to do the shuttle method and take wheat from one part of Mexico to another part of Mexico, and we were able to figure out how we can grow wheat on a smaller plant and increase its yields from like 1 to 5. Okay. He wasn't able to predict those types of things. So modern machinery, the agricultural revolution, he wasn't able to think of those things. So when he was writing this, remember, it's the 1700s. Most people just had small little farms. And what he was saying was those small little farms aren't going to be able to feed this many people. So a lot of people dismiss his ideas that food will be one of the major issues, the carrying capacity issues, right? Those human resources that will become will cause famine and cause the population of the human population to decrease. But there are kinks in the system, and because we mass produce most of our food, if something goes wrong, for example, with the corn is in everything we eat. Any processed food has corn in it, so it's the sugar, that added sugar, that's corn. Most of it is not for human consumption that's grown. It's used in genetically modified food that we eat, that if something happens to that system, it could collapse the entire system. And we don't have enough small farmers who could fill in if the big agricultural mega conglomerates in the United States fail. So there are some pros and cons to what Thomas Malthus was talking about. So a lot of people are always worried about population growth. Is it good? Is it bad? What do we do about it? India, of course, right now is, one of their big things is they don't have access to 24/7 water, and their population is now the largest in the world. So what do we do, right? How can India feed such a large population? And they have gone through the Green Revolution, but there's a lot of problems with the Green Revolution, and there are issues with it. So what does India do? And so throughout history, and in the United States it feels like that now with the removal of Roe v. Wade, but there are ways that the population has been controlled. Okay, policies have been implemented to curb or to increase populations. The United States used to use tax increases for people to have babies. They actually used to give you a tax break if you had more children. They have done away with that since, and there has been talk of it coming back. But that is one tool the United States has used. In France, there are initiatives in place now that are trying to get individuals to have more babies because there is an underlying cultural issues with immigration in France. So you can see how this class is important because a lot of countries sought migrations to increase their population. But now, right, just like the United States, oh, God forbid if the right type of person is not moving in, right? And this is where we see white nationalism in the United States is, oh, well, we want white people to have more babies because their population is shrinking. And that's why you hear a lot of the rhetoric you hear going on in the United States now. So think about that. It's all connected and tied together. But the One China policy was curb population growth through taxation in China. It was finally repealed in the fall of 2013, but it has consequences forever. So in certain areas of China, you were either taxed heavily if you had more than one child. In some parts, they told you couldn't have more than one child. And because boys culturally carry on the family name, they are also the social security system. Boys were, of course, looked at in higher grandeur than females were. So there were a lot of females that were either killed, aborted, or killed upon birth, aborted before birth, or left in orphanages. And this has created a completely major problem in China in terms of sex ratio. So there's a lot more males in China than there are females. China, of course, wants to grow economically on the world stage, and there's not enough people for the United States to buy all their stuff from, right? They also have now a lot of men in China now need to go outside of China to find a wife, and this has crossed a cultural watering down. And so there are a lot of issues. There's a lot of sex trafficking that happens. Girls are stolen from villages to marry Chinese men. It's the situation. No one ever thought through all the social consequences of having such a policy. So it's always important to think about that and understand that. There's also always been campaigns in terms of contraceptive campaigns, like in Mexico. But, don't forget, we have a lot of cultural hurdles and religious hurdles to overcome. So in Mexico, it's a very Catholic country, and contraceptive is looked at as a big no-no. And so to get some of these campaigns really going is definitely something that's hard to do. India is definitely something that's going to be a huge hurdle. Women are not looked at in certain parts of India, are not really looked at in the same light as males are. And so this is, if India wants to curb their population, which I don't know if they want to, but they will have to there's a lot of cultural and religious hurdles that are going to need to be overcome. So there's a lot with policies. So here is a little comparison on how 3 developed nations have tried to slow rapid growth. It's a good little thing from PBS. It goes on. Let me just show you here. So it tells you these little population campaigns that have happened in terms of what specific countries have done. So you'll have some information here in terms of China under Chairman Mao and what they did. Look at India's idea. And so there's a lot of different kind of 3 campaigns. Kenya promoting prosperity, to look at how to plan your family. So there's a lot in terms of that. Now, a lot of this comes, with lack of freedom and the idea of it's my body, my choice type of idea. How does that, how does that fit into population, etc. And we're going to talk more about this as the semester goes on in terms of how do you curb population growth without taking away people's freedoms, or how do we just a lot of people and the United Nations has said that we can't tell people how many children they can have. We just can't do it, especially in democracy. We can't do that. So there's a lot of questions to be had and topics and debates to be had. So that's why population is such a really important topic to cover. So that is it. So you want to make sure that you're looking at a couple of important factors in terms of looking at this stuff. Consequences to the One China child policy. You want to look at crude birth rate, crude death rate, doubling time, natural increase rate, total fertility rate, population density, agriculture density. So there's a lot that you need to know. You want to definitely know the stages of demographic transition. You want to know about population pyramids. You want to know who Thomas Malthus is. You want to understand why life expectancy has increased in the past century. So that video on how we've reached 7 billion is really good. I'm trying to think what else. So the demographic transition models, you want to know those. Jeffrey Sachs. gender inequality, carrying capacity, infant mortality rate. So there are some of the important terms that you want to focus in on as you're covering this. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this session, and I will see you next week.